Dear friends, this very beautiful meeting, and a very wonderful spirit, and the fact that it's being held out in the open, brings our heart back to the Holy Land, to Baji, in the surroundings of the most holy place in the Baha'i world. In the days of the Guardian, on the holy days, the whole day was celebrated. The friends would call on each other in the morning, exchange gifts. The Baha'is would all gather together in Baji under the shadow of the mansion where Baha'u'llah lived and have luncheon together. And then in the afternoon, about 4 o'clock, the friends would all gather about 95 meters out from the shrine of Baha'u'llah in these vast gardens. And there you would have the meeting, the spiritual part of whatever the feast happened to be. Let's say it was the date of the birth of Baha'u'llah, something of that nature was celebrated in Baji. And then a little later, Shoghi Effendi would come. He would conduct the services. He would have different ones read and chant. He himself would talk quite extensively about the conditions of the faith all over the world, so how the faith was progressing everywhere. And then he would lead the group of Baha'is to the shrine of Baha'u'llah. And as we entered the shrine, he would stand at the door. And each and every one as you entered, he would anoint with the attar of rose, so that the entire shrine was filled with this beautiful fragrance. Then the guardian would enter into the shrine, and he himself would chant the prayers in the shrine. His chanting was simply exquisite, simply gorgeous. There's no way you can explain the spirit in Shoghi Effendi's chanting. I have never heard anyone else that even can compare. It seemed to be a plaintive plea to God to assist the Baha'is all over the world, because that is always what he prayed for with the Baha'is. That the Holy Spirit might be with them, the Holy Spirit might quicken them, they might arise to the full extent of their capacity and quicken the world themselves, become the spirit which animates and dominates all of society. And then he would chant, as we always did in closing the feast, he would chant the visiting tablet. As I say, this gathering here today in the deep love of all the friends and the spirit that's abounding reminds me and brings me back to those days, which unfortunately will never occur again. One thing I would like to say, friends, and that is that these particular meetings that we're enjoying were arranged by the National Assembly. They've been so inspired and thrilled because there are so many new Baha'is coming into the faith all over. And it's a part of the movement of the faith throughout the entire world. That in most of the places, the activities of the cause are carried on by what we call new and young Baha'is, rather than the old Baha'is who've had experience in the earlier days of the cause. And they thought it would be very nice if we could have these informal gatherings where I could present to you something about the love of Abdu'l-Baha, the spirit of Abdu'l-Baha, the spirit of the Holy Land, the spirit of Shoghi Effendi, and some of the things which were done in the Holy Land, so that the names Abdu'l-Baha, the name Shoghi Effendi, may mean something vitally in your consciousness, may have a part of your spiritual being, and when you read and study their writing, enable you to have a much closer appreciation of what they did and what they said. And that is the purpose and the reason these meetings are now being undertaken. I should say to you that the reason I'm in America instead of in the Holy Land is because I wasn't well. And I came here to try and regain my health. And as soon as my strength improved, I started on this, Ms. Ioas and I started on this trip through the southern states of the United States in order to be where it's warm. And we've been greatly helped in doing so. We've been in Florida, we've been in Georgia, we've been in Louisiana, we've been in New Mexico, we've been in Arizona, and now we're in California. I likewise should like to say to all of you, to some of you, and to all of you that we're not strangers to California. many people think perhaps we are. This was our home. We're not native sons, but we're worse than native sons. We're those type of people that come here and have so much enthusiasm for California, we think there's no place else in the world. See, our Persian friends are smiling, but they should know that when Abdu'l-Baha was in San Francisco himself, the master said that if he didn't have to be in the Holy Land in Haifa and Akka, he would live in San Francisco. And I don't by that cast any reflections on Southern California. In any event, we now feel that we're back home, as Ioas and I. We're back home in more ways than one. We're back to the area of the world that we love. We love California. We love the Baha'is here. And it's really very, very wonderful to be so warmly received and to feel the spirit of hospitality and love which is engendered in these meetings. For the benefit of the new friends, I think we might just make a statement. You see, when I first became a Baha'i, and for quite a time, I seemed to feel that Bob was a divine manifestation. He appeared and he gave his message, and then he was martyred and ascended, and that was all there was to it. He was succeeded then by Baha'u'llah, and Baha'u'llah was a divine manifestation, and he enunciated his laws and his teachings, and he passed away. Then Abdu'l-Baha became the head of the cause, and he similarly was an independent character, and he conducted the cause as he thought best. Then when he passed away, he appointed Shag Effendi as the guardian of the cause, and so many people think, well, the guardian just took a hold and did things as he thought was best for the cause to evolve it into its present world state. But the fact of the matter is, friends, that isn't so. From the time of the Bab, there have been a steady fanning out of the principles under which these central figures of the cause worked in the Holy Land. For instance, while the Bab was announcing himself, those of you who've studied carefully the account of his announcement, while he was announcing himself to Mullah Hussein, he called upon the people of the West to go out and teach his cause. You see the point. This was something which he initiated, this idea of the Western world becoming the teachers of the Baha'i faith. It's interesting how it dates back. In some of his writings, he continues to refer to the order of Baha'u'llah, indicating that Baha'u'llah was going to set up his own order through which the Baha'i faith would expand and develop. And then, of course, he announced that he was the forerunner of this great universal manifestation the world was looking for. Now, when Baha'u'llah appeared, and he took up the mantle of his responsibility and bestowed these great spiritual bounties upon the world, Baha'u'llah, you will recall, in some of his most famous tablets turned to the West, he referred to England, for instance, as the example of the future governments of the world, where you combine kingship with democracy. He referred to the Federation of the United States as the ideal for establishing a world superstate on the idea of federation. He appealed to the leaders of the American republics, both North and South America, Central America, to rise up to establish universal peace and to crush the great oppressors of the world. He himself turned his eyes to the West. And when he was imprisoned in Adrianople, Abdu'l-Baha once said in New York, he said, if Baha'u'llah had not been imprisoned, if Baha'u'llah had not been imposed by the members of his own family, when he was in Adrianople, he would have made all of Europe Baha'i. He turned to the West, always the West. Now, when Abdu'l-Baha became the center of the covenant, what did the Master do? One of his first tasks was to finish the Shrine of the Bab, to start building the Shrine of the Bab. And I'd like to point out to you in passing, and if you take notes, be sure and take this note, because Shag Effendi wanted all the Baha'is to understand this. So many people seem to feel that Abdu'l-Baha was the one who initiated the project to build the Shrine of the Bab on Mount Carmel. This is not so. Baha'u'llah himself initiated this program. In 1890, when Baha'u'llah and some of his followers had their tent pitched on Mount Carmel. By the way, Baha'u'llah pitched his tent on Mount Carmel 4 times. Once out at the end of the mountain when he revealed the tablet of Carmel that our chairman referred to. Twice up in the area just above the shrine of the Bab. And the 3rd time out again near the head of the mountain. But at this particular time in 1890, while they were sitting under a group of cypress trees, and no one seems to know who planted those trees, when they were planted, nor why they were planted, but here in this mountain, which was nothing at all under development, it was all barren, except in certain areas there were lots of trees. It was inhabited by wild animals. When you went up there, they went in groups. They didn't go alone. Highwaymen stayed up there. Baha'u'llah was pitching his tent and sitting under these cypress trees. He called Abdul Baha and the different ones, and he pointed to the master. He says, right there is the spot to build the shrine of the Bab. And you should start to acquire that land right now. And then he said a little later to the master, he says, now is the time for you to start moving the remains of the Bab from Persia to the Holy Land. So the point is that Baha'u'llah initiated this program, not Abdul Baha. Abdul Baha was the center of the covenant to carry out those things which Baha'u'llah had initiated. Now what did Abdul Baha do? He started to establish his administrative order all over the world, which the Bab had referred to and which Baha'u'llah had outlined in detail in his writings. The teaching in the West. What did the master do? As soon as he became the head of the faith, he started to send great Persian teachers to America to teach the faith, to establish it in America and in Europe. No place in the world did he write to, no place in the world did he write so many tablets as he did to the Western world, especially the American Baha'is. Anything they wanted to know about, he'd write a short tablet or a long tablet, explaining to them all about the hidden secrets and mysteries of the spiritual teachings, the fulfillment of prophecies, and all of these things. When Abdul Baha was released from prison, where did he go? Did he go back to Persia to teach? Did he go to the East to teach? Did he go to Africa to teach? No, he came to Europe and America, and he did his great teaching work in the West. And then during those terrible days of World War I, you might say his last and final appeal to the West and program for the West was to reveal the tablets of the divine plan. Now, I mention this so you can see how there's this constant fanning out from the point of origin of the faith, the Bab, through Baha'u'llah, through Abdul Baha. Now, when Shoghi Effendi became the guardian of the cause, he felt that his task was to fulfill everything that the master had not finished, and that he had to carry out and establish those things which were in the writings and had not been completed. For instance, the first thing he did was to start in motion the plan to fulfill and to finish the Shrine of the Bab. I wish I had time to tell you in details about each of these items, but we don't. The second thing he did was to start to build the administrative order around the world. And his charter, he used a charter for everything he did. His charter for establishing administrative order around the world, the local and national assemblies, was the will and testament of Abdul Baha. Then he started to turn his eyes to the teaching possibilities all over the world. And his charter for the work which was done in the teaching field were the tablets of the divine plan addressed to the American Baha'is. Then when he started to build the world center of the faith in 1951 in the Holy Land, his charter was the tablet of Carmel. And we can speak about these things in more detail a little later. But I wanted to give you this picture of how this thing is just expanded under a definite order and a definite program. And it was not haphazard. It is definitely in line with the will of God from the time of the announcement of the Bab, carrying through until now. This administrative order is crowned by the top. The building has its roof, which is the Universal House of Justice. Now to the Western world that Baha'u'llah, the Bab, turned. And Baha'u'llah turned. the character which drew the Western world into the faith with a power of love, a power of attraction, with allurement that you can't describe, was Abdu'l-Baha. He was the one that presented the teachings of Baha'u'llah and the social program of Baha'u'llah in such a way that we in the West could understand, made it pleasing to us. He was able to draw us into this great web of spiritual power that we ourselves were not conscious of. And it's this unique figure that the Western world, in a certain extent, for a time seemed to turn to rather than to Baha'u'llah, because it was a figure you knew. Now, at the present time, we have so many new Baha'is in the West. They never had the privilege of meeting Abdu'l-Baha. They know nothing of his personality, the type of man he was, how he conducted himself. And therefore, I am going to, as I've been asked, to tell you of my meetings with Abdu'l-Baha and some of the experiences, so that you can have an appreciation and evaluate this greatest of all figures in the Baha'i faith outside of the divine manifestation. By the way, I wanted to ask, are there any people here who met Abdu'l-Baha outside of myself? I'm the only person. You see how history develops, how rapidly it is. There's only a few people left in the world who met Baha'u'llah. Only a few. One is the hand of the cause, Janabi Samandri. There's an elderly, very elderly lady who is very senile now, she's a descendant of Baha'u'llah, by the way, but she lives in the Holy Land, and she was another one. Muhammad Tabrizi. Well, lived in the household of Baha'u'llah with his family. They were serving Baha'u'llah when he was a lad. And I used to go over and sit in his room in the master's house and have him tell me stories about those days. It was very fascinating. One of them maybe I can share with you a little bit later, showing that Baha'u'llah, I used to look upon Baha'u'llah as his great lawgiver. Very serious, stern character, sitting up there and enunciating the law of God, and this is it. There you are. And I've met many Baha'is who have had the same feeling about Baha'u'llah. He was in his majesty, so great that he was not really a part of the human world, you might say. One evening I mentioned this to the Guardian. The Guardian says, "Oh, my goodness, no. No." He said, "You loved Abdu'l-Baha, you met him. You know how loving Abdu'l-Baha was, how kind he was, how he served everyone." Well, he says, if you multiply that 100 times, still you don't measure up to the love and the kindness of Baha'u'llah. Because he was so loving and so kind, people would try to take advantage of at times. So this story I'm going to tell of Muhammad Tabrizi indicates his great love and this informality at times surrounding Baha'u'llah. As I say, he lived in the household. He wasn't well one day. It was raining. It was cold and disagreeable. He had a cold. He wanted to go outside to play. And the greatest holy leaf, who ran the establishment, said, "No, you've got to go to bed and stay in bed. You stay in bed today, and tomorrow you'll be fine. It'll probably be sunny tomorrow, and then you can go out and enjoy yourself. But today you stay in bed." Well, after a little while, being a lad, he said, "Well, I want some candy." She says, "No, you can't have any sweets, because sweets are not good for you. You just take it easy, stay in bed today, I'll take care of you, and tomorrow you'll be feeling fine." Well, as all lads do, you see, a little bit later, he got out, and he went outside. As he went downstairs, the larder where they kept everything stored was open. And he went in there, and he got into the sugar barrel. And he started to fill his pockets with sugar, and his blouse with sugar, and his hands with sugar, and he had his mouth full with sugar, eating it, when he heard Baha'u'llah's step coming down the stairs. Baha'u'llah says, "Muhammad, No answer. He says, Muhammad, come out of there. So Muhammad came out and was trying to get this sugar down his throat, you see. Paula says, what do you got in your hands and your pockets, and what do you got in your mouth? And he said, sugar. Paula says, didn't the greatest holy leaf tell you you weren't to take any sweets today at all? Muhammad said, yes, sir. He says, now, Muhammad, whenever the greatest holy leaf gives you any instructions, you obey them immediately, and don't you ever dare to disobey her. Never again. But, he said, the next time you want some candy or some sweets, you come and see me before you see the greatest holy leaf. I'll tell you one more story that shows this humanity of Baha'u'llah. I'll tell you many that we had in the Orient. This was told me, by the way, by Muhammad Tabrizi himself, sitting in his room in the Master's house. Baha'u'llah was surrounded by these very great Persian characters. And one day they were all sitting there in his room. And he said to the first one, he said, how would you like it if I send you to the Haifa kingdom today? And he said, well, Baha'u'llah, you told me to go and teach in Persia. You know, I got to go. I got to do that. He said to the second one, he says, how would you like it if I send you to the Haifa kingdom today? Well, Baha'u'llah, you know, I have this work to do and that work to do, and it's taking a long, long time. And this can't just be impossible. Then he said to the third one, he says, how would you like it if I send you to the Haifa kingdom today? The third one turned to the fourth one, he says, please tell Baha'u'llah I'm deaf in both ears, will you? Now this is the humanity of Baha'u'llah, so that you get a little feeling about his love and his warmth. And while I'm doing this, let's not mistake this great love, the simplicity of Baha'u'llah for the greatness of his writings. For instance, we refer to the Baha'i faith as a revealed religion. We refer to Christianity as a revealed religion. Hollis? Are you using good Persian? Hollis mean is that all? Where was I? Christianity is a revealed religion. Mohammedanism is a revealed religion. Any religion that has a prophet is a revealed religion. Now what does that mean? That means that the will of God and the teachings of God are revealed to and through a divine manifestation. It's only in the Baha'i faith really that we have an exact example of how this revelation works. And this is what I want to share with you so you understand. If I want to write a book, if you want to write a book, what do? You start a lot of research to see what the people, the thinking people of the world and the authorities believe about this particular subject. And then you make notes of things that appeal to you. And then you put them together. And then you make your own comment of what you think about it. And after maybe a year or 2 years' work along this line, you get someone to review the book. And then you think, well, it's all right. So it's published. Now, Baha'u'llah was entirely different. When Baha'u'llah started to reveal his tablets or his messages to the world, it just was a flood of water flooding right through. So fast that his amanuenses, his secretaries, couldn't keep up with it. They only had one who could take down Baha'u'llah's writings when he was revealing tablets, because he spoke so rapidly, so quickly, just like a flood of water coming through it. And these things were taken in later. They'd be written out, Baha'u'llah would review them, and finally they'd be gone. That was Baha'u'llah, the way he revealed his teachings and revealed his tablets and his messages to the world. They were not things that were prepared in advance or thought out in advance. The Holy Spirit spoke through and revealed what it wished for the entire world. The Book of the Adhan The Book of the Agon. I suppose you've all studied it carefully, but Shoghi Effendi felt the Book of the Agon was one of Baha'u'llah's greatest writings. That was revealed in a period of not exceeding 3 days. 3 days. Because his relative the Bab came to Baghdad to see Baha'u'llah and ask these various questions, and Baha'u'llah revealed the Book of the Agon and the answers. And on the 3rd day he had the Book of the Agon to take back home. His complete answers. This is his revelation. This power of the Spirit, which has to have no forethought. It's the will of God functioning to humanity. Now come to Abdu'l-Baha. Abdu'l-Baha was the most unique character. It's difficult for me to even try to explain anything about the Master to you, and I'll tell you why. It's impossible for an atom to describe the sun. One of my duties was that I would go and meet the Oriental pilgrims when they arrived on the 2nd day. The 1st day they called on the Guardian, and he got properly settled, and the next day he'd have me go up and have lunch with them. And I would show them his various maps that he had prepared of the progress of the world, pictures of the various temples to be built like in Germany and Australia and Africa and Persia and so on. And one day I was asking questions about the great power of Shoghi Effendi in doing all of these things. Well, I don't know exactly what I said, but he reported to the Guardian. And that evening the Guardian says, well, you met with the press, what did they have to say? And I explained to the Guardian what I had said. And I made a particular point about this one who said that the Guardian was accomplishing so much. And I said, I tried to explain to him that the Master was the branch, and that the Guardian was the extension of the branch. Consequently, the fruit doesn't come on the branch, it comes on the twigs and the ends of the branches. And that's why the fruit will be on, Shoghi Effendi will produce the fruit. The Guardian looked at me very sharply. He says, Leroy, don't you ever do that again. I said, well, Shoghi Effendi. He says, don't you ever mention my name in the same context or thought of that of Abdu'l-Baha. He says, Abdu'l-Baha is the sun, I'm an atom. Abdu'l-Baha is the ocean, I'm a drop. Now, if that relationship exists between Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi, just think of what exists between Shoghi Effendi and us. We just can't be found except through the grace of God. So for me now to talk about Abdu'l-Baha is very difficult. Therefore I confine myself to my experience. When we went to meet Abdu'l-Baha, he was stopping in the Plaza Hotel in Chicago. And as we neared the hotel, I had a strong feeling that the Master was going to leave the hotel. And I said to our party, I said, if we don't hurry, we're going to miss Abdu'l-Baha. So they said, how do you know we're going to miss him? I said, I don't know. I just have that feeling. So we hurried up. As we got to the hotel, I said, now, I'm telling you, we're going to miss the Master. If we don't hurry, we'll go faster. So we started to hurry faster. We went into the hotel. Now, mind you, I'd never been in this hotel before. Never saw it. I said, the Master's going out the other entrance. And it was an L arrangement with the hall that way, and he was going out this other door around the other side of the L. My father says, how do you know he's leaving? Did you see anybody in a turban? Did you see the flowing robes that they're wearing? Or did you see the Master? I said, no. He said, how do you know he's leaving then? I said, I saw the light around the corner. Well, we hurried around, and as we went out the door, the Master was getting into the automobile to leave for his famous meeting with Jane Addams and to talk at the Hull House in Chicago. We stood against the wall, and some of the secretaries pointed out that there were new Baha'is that arrived. So the Master beckons us to come up to shake hands with him. And so any of you that go to the Orient, so you'll understand, when the Oriental beckons you, he beckons you this way. What do you think when you go that way, you know? Anyway, that's the way the master beckons to him. We started to go up, and as I approached the master, there was the physical form. This beautiful, beautiful form. And yet there was flooding through Abdu'l-Baha, these floods of light. Beautiful cream, like flashes of light. You could see them just pulsating through him, yet all sort of confined within this physical form. And actually it was so strong that I was overcome. Well, when I came to again, the master was still beckoning us to come forward. And I went up and approached Abdu'l-Baha, and I'll never forget when I shook his hands. I felt his hand like that to see if it was actually, you know, a human hand like we had. Well, we went to the Hull House. And it's very interesting that you have to understand Abdu'l-Baha was the most exquisitely beautiful character you can ever see. You've seen his pictures. But the spirit that flooded through him, you can't see in any picture. He had this dynamic power that just flooded everywhere. He'd walk into a restaurant, for instance, and there'd be no ears, and everybody rise to their feet. This is Abdu'l-Baha. He'd walk down the street, and people would step aside on the sidewalk and bow and went by like that. Westerners. Abdu'l-Baha, they never heard of him. The Baha'is would be hovering around him, and as he'd walk, they'd hold his Ava, and they'd hold his hand, the coat of the Ava, and trying to touch him, trying to get just to touch the master. And this is what happened when you go into the Hull House. And as he comes out, you see, all the Baha'is always just flocking around him this way, this great power which you can't describe. His eyes were something that is in those eyes was the whole world. There was the majesty of God. There was the pathos of the whole world in those eyes. I saw him once when he was talking about the enemies of the cause and what they've done to damage the cause. And there was the wrath of God in those eyes. Just balls of fire. I'll never forget it. In other times there was this great love that just drew you to him. I don't know, as many times as I was in the master's presence, I never know what he talked about. Because I just sit there and look at those eyes. They're just fascinating. And that's the way it was. Well, my second meeting with Abdu'l-Baha, we again went to the Plaza Hotel. And I had bought him a beautiful bouquet of flowers. I used to love the carnations very much, especially white carnations. And I bought him a beautiful bouquet of carnations that stood about 3 feet high, and they're very expensive in Chicago. And as we got up to the hotel, I said to my father, I said, you know, I've changed my mind. I'm not going to give Abdu'l-Baha these flowers. He said, what's the matter with you? Everybody brings the master flowers. I said, I know, but it's not, I don't think it's right for me to do it. So we got a little closer, and I said, well, I made up my mind. I'm not going to give Abdu'l-Baha these flowers. He says, well, what's the matter? Well, I said, I'm not going to the master to curry favors. I'm bringing him my heart. And what there is to it, he can take. Well, we got in the hotel, and I said, well, now, I'm not going to give Abdu'l-Baha these flowers, and I'm going to leave them down here on the bench. My father said, give them to me, I'll give them to the master. So we went up into the room. The master had his sleeping quarters, and then he had a reception room. And we got into the reception room. It was full of people, because that's the way it was all the time. One group would come with 15, 20, 30 people. The master would come out and visit with them and talk with them and answer questions, and then they would go. By that time, a new group were ready to come in. And then he had to meet another group and talk to them and visit with them. Well, we were ushered in, and there was only 1 or 2 seats. My father sat on one. I sat on the floor at the master's feet looking at him. Those eyes again. Father presented him this bouquet of flowers that I had bought, you see, the white carnations. He held them in his hand, smelt them continuously as he talked, put his face in them. Then when he finished his talk, he got up and started to shake hands with everyone. He shook hands with everyone, and he handed them one of these flowers. So everyone got one of these flowers. Of course, everyone would do anything in the world to get a flower from Abdul Baha. So as he was going around, I was standing behind the master. And I started to count. 1, 2, 3, 5 flowers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Say, am I going to get a flower? Now this is the interesting thing. The minute I had that thought in my mind, am I going to get a flower? The master turned right around, and he had a red rose on the lapel of his coat. Rolled off the red rose, and had a pin, and the pin cut his finger, and the blood was on the rose, and he had it. That was Abdul Baha. Now I must tell you one or two things that you would understand about him and his effect on the public. 2 or 3 stories I'm going to tell. I don't want to get too much time. There are so many I could talk forever, you understand, about Abdul Baha. I could talk forever about the Guardian, Holy Land. This was a meeting that Abdul Baha was invited to speak at the very, very important church on the south side of Chicago. A very wealthy congregation. A very noted pastor who was making a great name for himself. One of the deacons had heard Abdul Baha speak in New York. So he insisted that an invitation be extended to Abdul Baha to speak at this church. The pastor was opposed to it. Didn't like it. Didn't want it. And argued against it. So finally the deacon just overruled him and said, well, we're going to invite Abdul Baha to come. He's a great international figure. And the invitation was extended. This is a big church. Maybe he held at least 1,000 people. Had balconies and so on. Why, as we were there early, so as to get seats close up in front where we could watch the master. And the master had time for the service, and the master hadn't arrived. So the pastor started, and they sang a couple of extra songs, and then they prayed a little longer than they usually do. And then he had the scripture reading and a few other things, trying to delay the service. Finally, it delayed as long as he thought it could without great difficulty, so he arose. And you could see he was quite put out. And he said, you know, we were to have been graced today with the presence of a great scholar and an eminent figure from the East. Because the trouble is, he thinks he's still in the East, where time doesn't count. And he hasn't arrived. So I'm going to go ahead and preach the sermon. Well, he started to preach the sermon. He was waxing eloquent, and as they do to make it more important, waving his hands like I do. And all of this type of thing. And there was a noise in the rear of the room. And he looked back, excited. Then there was more noise. And then people were standing up. He started to push his hands like this around, you know. And then suddenly, everybody rose right to their feet. Everybody. And looking back, Abdul Baha was walking down the center aisle, just arrived. Now those people had never met the master, knew nothing about him. And yet, even though the pastor was preaching a sermon, they rose up when the master entered. The master went up and sat down on the platform, folded his arms, closed his eyes, sat like he's going to fall asleep. Well, the minister introduced Abdul Baha very graciously. The master arose, and he said this morning in the scripture reading, the pastor read from you from the book of St. John, chapter so-and-so, verses so-and-so. And I'm going to explain to you what they mean. Now, these readings had occurred 20 minutes before Abdul Baha arrived. By the time I tell you about the laying of the cornerstone at the temple in Lumet, I'm one of the few people alive, I guess, who were present when Abdul Baha laid that cornerstone. That takes a little time, so we'll have to have that the next time we come. I tell you only one little incident that again shows this graciousness of the master. We were all assembled on the temple grounds. We were told he was going to arrive on the Linden Avenue side, about where the entrance is now to the temple. And as the master always did, he arrived at the other side, the Sheridan Road side. So the friends all rushed over there, and then they followed the master, and he walked, and he looked at the grounds, and was speaking about the grounds and so on, and again the Baha'is were holding on to his abba and the sleeves of his coat. Now he could make progress, I don't know. And the woman who brought the cornerstone, Nettie Tobin, you all know the story. This part of it you don't know. She was following the master very closely. When I was fasting, we all were, of course, howling right there. She opened her purse and she took out a pair of scissors. Now, as I told you, all of them were holding the master's abba, and I thought she was going to snip a piece off one. I said, good Lord, she wouldn't have dared to do that. But he walked around and was walking around and talking, and suddenly he stopped right in front of her. She was standing there, and he was standing in front of her. And he had a habit of pushing his turban up this way. He'd push it from the back and down almost over his eyes down here, so you think he couldn't see. And he'd stand that way for me, talked a bit that way, and when he pushed his turban up, some of the locks of his hair fell out from under the turban. Yes. She jumped right up, took one of the boxes. Abba pushed his turban back out properly and went about, nothing was said. This master, always having things in hand. That evening, I'm not going to tell the rest about the laying of the cornerstone, that will take time. But one of the evenings of the convention, they had a public meeting in Chicago in the Drill Hall in the Masonic Temple. You've read the master's talk there very often. Now the master, when he spoke, he didn't stand in one place like we do. The secretary would stand at the podium and would translate, but the master would walk back and forth. You've seen the moving picture of it in Greenacre where he was talking. That's the way he always spoke. He'd just walk back and forth, waving his hands and gesticulating and emphasizing the points this way and like that. And as he did that, these beautiful flowers all on the platform, he'd go and he'd put his arms right around a big bouquet, he'd put his face right down in it and smell it, and he'd keep on talking then, and he'd go to another bouquet, and I knew what was going to happen till that meeting was over. Anyway, as he was speaking and talking in Persian, the head is worked out perfectly. The master would speak, and then the translation went on, about a half a sentence, and there was no sensation of any break whatsoever, because it was so perfectly done. And the master, once in a while, the secretary, this translator, would get caught for an American word. And the master would be talking in Persian, and he'd be caught, the master would say, summer. Then in a few minutes he'd be caught for another word, the master would say the sky, or whatever. Now the master didn't speak English, you see. Well, as soon as the meeting was over, the friends all rushed up, of course. I never saw so many people just flooding almost. It looked like a mob action with Abu Baha. I was greatly concerned. We had brought along with us, friends, an elderly woman by the name of Dealey. The name Paul Kingston Dealey, as you study the early history of the faith in America, you run across his name. He's one of the great early Baha'i teachers, American teachers. He became one of the early Baha'is. Thornton Chase was the first Baha'i in 1896. And he became a Baha'i and then was teaching others. He had a course of 12 lectures. And his book on Bible prophecy and so on are very, very wonderful. At the end of the 12 lectures, you should either be a Baha'i or not a Baha'i. And at the end of the 12 lectures, if you were a Baha'i, you write out Abu Baha. Will you please accept me into the kingdom of God? That was the way you became a Baha'i. Well, my parents became Baha'is in 1898. Studying under Mr. Dealey, they took this course. And of course we treasure the letters they wrote to the Master and his replies, accepted as Baha'is. Well, Mr. Dealey passed away. And Mrs. Dealey, shortly before Abdu'l-Baha arrived, went blind. Or was going blind, rather. So this particular evening, with these thousands of people hovering around Abdu'l-Baha, again holding his ab and not letting him get through, shaking hands and holding his hand, his coat and everything, she said to her son, she says, Arthur, you please go up and tell one of the secretaries that I want to see Abdu'l-Baha. And I remember Arthur saying, well, Mother, what's the matter with these 1,000 people around here? And the Master's going to have an audience with you? It's impossible. She says, Arthur, if you'll go up and have the secretary tell Abdu'l-Baha, I guarantee you he'll see me tonight, right here. So the son went up, talked to one of the secretaries, and spoke to Abdu'l-Baha, and left instructions for her to sit on the side of the aisle. He was going to go out that aisle. When he got opposite her, he stand and talk to her. She sat there, and I sat next to her, so I could see what went on. And when he got there, I find all these people around, everyone talking to the Master, shaking hands, and his laughing, and his cordial spirit. I'm talking about how this revelation comes without a moment's hesitation. Destiny decided in a second. They called attention to the fact that this is Mrs. Dealey. And he turned and greeted her and shook hands with her, and graciously, as he always did. And she looked up at him. She took his hand. She says, Abdu'l-Baha, if you put your hand on my forehead, I know that I will see. The Master said, yes, my daughter, that's right. If I put my hand on your forehead, you will see. But you have to make a choice. You can't have your spiritual sight and your physical sight both. Which do you want? She says, Abdu'l-Baha, that's my choice. She says, I'd be blind for thousands of years before I give up my spiritual sight. And he smiled and patted her on the back and said, well said, my daughter. And off he went with this crowd, singing and hopping. The destiny of that person, 1 second. Well, didn't take hardly as long as I've taken to tell it. This was Abdu'l-Baha. And I've seen it with so many times. I can tell you story after story like this. I'll tell you one more and then we stop. About the Master. He was in San Francisco and was invited to... the San Francisco Baha'is had many, many invitations for him to speak. One of them, they found out, was a group of anarchists, which in those days were not very popular. I don't know if they're popular now in California or not. I've been here for a long time. And they had a group who would meet. They'd have a noted speaker. They'd heckle the speaker. They'd interrupt. Then when they got done, they'd argue with him. And then they'd deliver their oration as to what was right and what was wrong and all of these things. So the Baha'is were very much concerned. And they said, we canceled this meeting immediately when they found out, you see. One of them said, well, after all, Abdu'l-Baha knows about it, so we better not cancel it without consulting him. They went to the Master and asked him what they should do, that they planned to cancel the meeting. He says, oh, no, you leave it alone. You've accepted it. It's arranged. The Master will speak. I'll speak. Well, he went there that afternoon. It was a miserable hall. Low ceilings, light sticking down in your face, ventilation poor. Front row, all of these dynamiters sitting right up there ready to go. They told him he couldn't talk about God, they couldn't talk about religion. So what's Abdu'l-Baha going to talk about? That's what he came here to talk about, was God and about religion. So when he got up, he said, I'm going to talk to you about the philosophy of the East and the philosophy of the West. Never use the word spirit once. But you read that, find that talk, and you will find it's one of the greatest expressions and explanations of the relationship of spirit and matter that you'll ever read anyplace. It's remarkable. Well, he finished his talk and he sat down. I said, well, all right, here it comes. The leader of this group stood up He says, you know, we've been graced today by the visit of a very remarkable character, a very great person. He's the greatest we've ever had. He says, I move that we have no discussion whatsoever to close the meeting. So the meeting was closed. When they got back to Mrs. Goodall's home, where the master was staying, tea was being prepared. The master suddenly started to laugh. And then he started to laugh harder. And then he started to laugh almost sort of vociferously, you see. The Baha'i is getting very embarrassed. Finally he stopped and he said, you want to know why I'm laughing, of course, don't you? And they said, of course, Dr. Baha'i, we do. Now listen to this. He said, you thought that Abdul Baha was going to be embarrassed this afternoon, didn't you? And they said, yes, of course we do. He says, let this be a lesson to you. That Abdul Baha is the master of every situation, under every circumstance. And he never is embarrassed unless Baha'u'llah wants him embarrassed for the good of his cause. Never. This was Abdul Baha, under all circumstances. I could tell you so many stories. Well, friends, we turn to Shoghi Effendi. This character that is not so well known in the world, person except by those who made the pilgrimage. Shoghi Effendi was unique. His stature, he was rather a small man. I was rather surprised. Because I had rather felt, and we rather feel in the West, that in order to direct great world affairs, you have to be a big man. But he wasn't. He was a small man. He wasn't a small man, but he wasn't a tall man. And when he opened his mouth, goodness gracious, the wisdom was poured out. The graciousness that was there. It was hardly to be measured. He wore Western business suits. He always wore a dark tie, a white shirt and white collar. He wore a combination of a raglan and a nabob. Going down to his knees, he wore that all the time. He was usually black, occasionally a lighter one. He wore black fez, always wore black fez, never anything else. You never saw him without his fez. He was a very exquisitely beautiful man. Sharp, chiseled features. Wonderful eyes. Expressive eyes. The eyes, those of you who've seen the picture of the Bab, those are the guardian's eyes. His eyes were like those of the Bab because he's a descendant of the Bab. He was an Afghan. His other features were quite similar to those of Abdul Baha. His nose was very similar to Abdul Baha's. His chin very sharp. His hand was very delicate and beautiful. His motions very graceful. And he spoke again. He always gesticulated with his hands. He had the most delicate hands you ever saw, and the greatest holy leaf. When he was a child, she used to hold him on his lap, and she'd take his hand and she'd look at it and she'd say, those are the hands of Baha'u'llah. Exactly the same hands that Baha'u'llah had. I was up on the shrine while we were building the shrine. I was up on the top of the shrine, up in the dome. The sun was shining from the west down this way, and someone entered the eastern gate towards the inner garden. And I looked down and I said, oh my God, there's Abdul Baha. I said, is it? I looked again, I said, it's the master. How is this possible? Then I looked again and it was Shoghi Effendi. Now if he'd had a white turban, he'd had a beard, it would have been the master. His walk was the same, his gesturing was the same, his swing and his gait was the same. So when you've seen these pictures of Abdul Baha, you've seen these of Shoghi Effendi. One thing I want to say before I tell you this story. I told you how Shoghi Effendi would sit at the table and answer questions and talk with the Western Baha'is. His English was exquisite. Exquisite. You've read his writings, and how wonderful they are. When he spoke across the table, he used the most exquisite combination of words, phrases, the most wonderful expressions. It was just, you could sit there sometimes and listen to him, and it was just like seeing a great artist on the painting, and he's drawing the painting. He draws the tree and the house and the animals and the airplane, and you see it there. And that's the way he used language. You could just see him painting these pictures with words. Priya called many times to show Effendi, let us take down on a tape, like you're doing here. Let us take these things down on a tape. He says, no, that isn't proper. Well, let us take them down and just get these exquisite English expressions of yours, these combinations of words will destroy everything else. He says, no, that isn't proper. We don't do it. The Persians tell me that when those who made the pilgrimage, that his Persian was just as exquisite. His Arabic, those who spoke Arabic with the Guardian, his Arabic was just as almost a Quranic Arabic that he used. Beautiful. This was this great capacity of Shoghi Effendi, directing the affairs all over the Baha'i world. And yet he thought of little things. And this story I start to tell you now about this member of the Canadian NSA who was present. They had as one of their tasks as a crusade to translate some of Baha'u'llah's writings and the Baha'i writings into language. So this woman said the night before she left, she said, Shoghi Effendi, in the writings there's certain things we want to translate. And Baha'u'llah uses the illustration of the nightingale and the rose. You all know that those wonderful expressions from the Garden of Rizwan and from those areas of the nightingale and the rose. You see? They said, no, the Eskimos don't know anything about a nightingale. They don't know anything about a rose. So they translate and say the penguin and the snowflower. The Guardian says, no. When you translate Baha'u'llah's writings, exactly as it is. Exactly. Now, any books that you write, or anyone writes, explanatory of the cause, use your illustrations of the penguin and the snowflower. So the next evening, there was the time to say goodbye to this pilgrim. And the Guardian usually, in his practice, when he was saying goodbye, he reached into the pocket of his coat of his, and he pulled out a small bottle of attar rose. He said, now, when you go back to Canada, I want you to take this attar rose and anoint each member of the National Assembly and give them my love, and you anoint them on my behalf. Thank you very much, Shoghi Effendi. He reached in his pocket again. He held up another bottle, small bottle, of the attar rose. He says, now, with this, you keep this. And when any Eskimos become Baha'is, you anoint them on my behalf with this attar rose. And in that way, they will begin to get acquainted with Baha'u'llah's nightingale and rose of Persia. All of these, so many of these little things like this in Shoghi Effendi. Friends, may I say, before we close this part of the meeting, maybe there's some questions someone would like to ask before we go ahead just and close. All right. Do any of you like to ask me any questions before we... No questions?
I would like to know if you could tell us what the 19th, if there's any... I know that there's a special significance to the 19th.
The number 9.
Ask me so much about
Yes.
the 9 and the 19th.
I think you should get some of the Oriental scholars to explain that to you. The Guardian was asked one evening the significance of 19. And he spoke of some matters which, frankly, I didn't understand because they had to do with the Orient. But he made the point that there is a great spiritual significance in 19, and that's why the Bab selected it. In the Orient, let me say this, they don't have numbers like we do, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The alphabet is the value of the numbers. Isn't that right? In other words, Aleph is A is 1, and so on. And that's how you figure out the values of the Bab is 5, and Baha is 19, and R is 9, and so forth. Now, the value of unity is 19 in the Persian language. And the Guardian said in the future it will be found out why and the great significance of the number 19 all over the world. One thing that we did find out once, for instance, one of the Baha'is were at the observatory, not the observatory, but the planetarium in Chicago. And they move the heavens around. They have them all fixed, so you move them around. And in the manner in which the stars, the moon, and the sun, and the earth ordinarily move. And significantly enough, every 19 years, the sun, the moon, and the earth are in exactly the same position. It takes 19 years for this movement to take place and repeat itself. Now, whether that has, you see, the depth of the possibility. If Fazy or Puritanian come here, you ask them because they're versed in detail in these things. Any other questions, friends? Yes.
I wonder if you could tell us why is it proper to take the word of Abu Bakr or Shoghi Effendi that?
Well, Shoghi Effendi, you see, Shoghi Effendi felt that the Baha'i faith revolved around three central figures: the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and Abdu'l-Baha. Now, he was the first of an entirely different line of development within the faith. He was the guardian of the cause, and he wanted it to be thoroughly understood that he had no association from a spiritual standpoint, a spiritual station, with any one of those three great figures. And that's why he always held himself in the background. To me, he seemed to portray no personality. He was like a mirror. And the mirror, when it was reflected towards God, whatever was in the mirror, there it was. If he wanted to, something was happening in America, the mirror to reflect towards America, and there it was in front of it. You couldn't get out of it, you couldn't escape it. If it was India, if it was any other part of the world. Another way, what Shoghi Effendi was, that he was a motor, a generator. When the juice was on, it operated. It didn't make any difference whether he was well or whether he was sick or what was the matter. It just operated. And it is the most unique thing that you can't understand it. It's impossible to understand it, for me at least. And I used to sit there and look at Shoghi Effendi. How does this divine guidance work? How is it that this is the sign of God on earth? What is this relationship? Because of his humility. But the Master was easy to realize because there was always something flooding through the Master. But Shoghi Effendi, he had this great work to do. For instance, the 10-year crusade, which I'm going to speak about. He said, this is the task God's given us to do. He never said a word about my crusade. See the nature of Shoghi Effendi. Are there any other questions, friends? Would you like to take your break now?
Yes. For about 10 minutes, please, people, and then we'll reassemble. We'll give you a chance to stretch your legs, get a drink of water. We would like, because we were kind of busy here, as you may recall.
Dear friends, I don't know whether you all realize or not, perhaps many of you haven't been Baha'is long enough, to realize that the so-called 10-year crusade, which began in 1953 and ended in 1963, was the greatest spiritual crusade in all religious history. There has never been in any previous religion any organized attempt for the adherents of that religion to set out and spread their faith over a wide area, at the same time set up their administrative procedures as they went along, as we did during this 10-year crusade, and with a relatively small number of people. The Guardian continuously impressed on our mind that this was the greatest spiritual crusade in all religious history, and being conducted by relatively few people.
I mentioned to you about these various attributes of Shoghi Effendi. One of them was his generalship, how he laid out his plans and his program, and how he finally built up to his climax for the great victories for the Friends. Now, naturally, Shoghi Effendi felt one of the greatest responsibilities he had was to urge the Friends and to carry out the teaching work more aggressively than had ever been done before. Because after all, the second great commandment to every individual is to share with everyone the divine knowledge which you have received. And this was not being done in an aggressive manner and in a powerful enough manner so the cause was not spreading rapidly enough. And Shoghi Effendi was very vitally concerned. So as you'll recall, he sent various messages urging the Baha'is to redouble their effort and go out and teach. But as he surveyed the world affairs, he found that the thing that was lacking, one of the things that was lacking, is that we had no instrument that could be used to carry forward the teaching work on a collective basis. One evening he shocked us very, very much, those of us from the West. When he was speaking about the teaching work and how little progress had been made, he says, take Martha Root. Now, you all know the name of Martha Root if you don't know who she was. She was the star teacher of the Western world. Went all over the world, around the world 2 or 3 times. He said, take Martha Root and all of her travels and all of her teaching. What have we got left? What have we got? Nothing. Nothing we got. Queen Marie of Romania became a Baha'i, and that's all that you have of the definite fruits. And he says, what have we got of the work of some of these other great early teachers? Where is it? And I realized that the reason we had nothing is because we had no program of following up the work these great teachers did. We had nothing to see that, no one to see that this work was properly coordinated. We had no one to see that there were pioneers sent behind these teachers, that there were no settlers, there was no literature, there were none of these things. So I realized we had to delay our world teaching program while we built the administrative order. And that's why when you read in the literature that the teaching work was delayed for 25 years, it was delayed for 25 years while Shoghi Effendi was building the local and the national assemblies. And how well he built, you all know. How successful were these assemblies. How successfully they were functioning. And then when he started the teaching work, you remember his various messages in which he said, the purpose of developing the administrative order up to the present time is so we have a teaching facility. And this I want to impress, friends, on you very, very definitely, those of you who are on administrative committees, those of you who are on local assemblies or national assemblies, that the purpose of the administration today is to be a facility for teaching. It is not alone to carry out the work of keeping order amongst the Baha'is. The fact of the matter is, if all of the Baha'is were busy teaching, you wouldn't have any problems to settle. You'd be so busy trying to decide how to coordinate their activities, how to create facilities for teaching, that you wouldn't have time for anything else. When we sat in the Holy Land, the 9 hands who, after the passing of Shoghi Effendi, most of your problems were personality problems of people. People go out and teach them, they don't have a personality problem because they're fulfilling the destiny which God created them for, and they're complying with the teachings of Baha'u'llah. So friends, one of the first messages is that the administrative order today, its main purpose is to facilitate teaching. Help everyone to teach. Coordinate the teaching work. See that literature is available. See that places are opened up. See that other people go in to support and succeed the teachers and the pioneers that have gone there. And in this way, aggressively spreading out over the world, we'll intensify this program of spreading the message of the glory of Baha'u'llah to the entire world. With the development and the perfection, you might say, of this administrative program on the local and the national level, Shoghi Effendi started to turn his eyes to the tablets of the divine plan and the teaching work of the Baha'is all over the world. There was established in America, which was really the beginning, what we call the first 7-year plan. That was established in 1937 and ran until 1944. And the purpose was to establish the Baha'i faith in all of the states of the United States and all the provinces of Canada. This was over a 7-year period. Then the second 7-year plan was established, which introduced the Baha'i faith to all of the countries of Europe, and Central America and South America. Now, there were similar teaching plans in other parts of the world. England had its plan, Persia had its plan, Germany had its plan, Egypt had its plan. All of the countries where the cause was firmly established had teaching plans to carry out, all ending about the year 1953. Now, the thing that concerned the Guardian the most about this teaching work was this: that in the book of Daniel, and the Guardian felt that Daniel was one of the greatest of the prophets, the minor prophets of Israel. There are 3 dates that refer to the Baha'i faith. The first date refers to the announcement of the Bab. The second date refers to the announcement of Baha'u'llah in Baghdad in 1863. And the third was the statement, "Blessed is he who waited and cometh to the 1335 days." You're all familiar with it. Now, Abdu'l-Baha had explained 2 things. One, that the 1335 days referred to the year 1963. He also explained in some answered questions and in other talks that he gave that at that time the cause of God would be spread around the world. So Shoghi Effendi said, what are we going to do to spread this cause around the world? That's the task which you were left by the Master to fulfill. That's the task which Daniel had prophesied. And we only have a short time and a limited number of people to do these great things. How are we going to proceed? Bear in mind that in the days of the Bab, the Baha'i faith was established in only 2 countries. In the days of Baha'u'llah, it spread into another 13 countries, making 15 countries at the time of the ascension of Baha'u'llah. The days of Abdu'l-Baha, the cause spread in 20 countries more, making a total of 35 countries. And that's not very many to contemplate when you're thinking of spreading the cause around the world. Now, after the success of these teaching plans in various parts of the world, the Guardian conceived the idea of this 10-year crusade from 1953 to 1963. And I'll never forget, when he returned, he usually went every summer, he went to Europe, because the summers in Haifa are very, very difficult. They're very, very difficult for a person with heart difficulty. I'm not there for 3 months during the year myself because of the humidity and the intense heat. The Guardian left it. The weather affected him adversely. And he was in Europe. He returned in 1952 from being in Europe. One evening we were all sitting there, and Maria Cullum says, well, Shoghi Effendi has some very wonderful news to share with you. So then the Guardian started to outline the 10-year crusade. Well, of course, we all sat back. We were flabbergasted, and we couldn't digest it. This 10-year crusade with this handful of Baha'is, and we weren't successful in our teaching work anywhere to speak of. And how are we going to do these tremendous things that the Guardian was calling for? Well, we were just too staggered. The next night, Shoghi Effendi again talked naturally. When the Guardian had something like this on his mind, he talked every night about it. But the next night he talked. The following night he talked. Finally, when we sort of became adjusted to the idea that something like this was going to happen, he went around the table again and he said, what do you think is going to be the easiest thing for this crusade? What do you think is going to be the most difficult thing? And he asked everyone around the table with their viewpoints. Millie Collins and Mason Ramey and Lockwood and Sylvia and the Revell girls and myself. He said, Roy, what do you think is going to be the easiest thing in this crusade? Well, I said, Chug Effendi, the easiest thing is going to be the settlement of the faith in 131 new countries. I'll never forget his eyes started to come out. Whenever he was surprised, he looked at you and he said, why would you say a thing like that? Well, I said, Chug Effendi, that has glamour to it. And the Baha'is will be going there for the glamour of it. They'll be going there because they want to introduce the cause into a new area. And Abdu'l-Baha and yourself, you said that those who went into these new countries would be the conquerors of those countries. Here's an individual who wants to go to become a conqueror of one of these countries. I said, that's simple. They'll go in right away. There'll be nothing to it. But he said, what do you think is the most difficult thing? I've been treasurer, to USNSA for 3 years. So I said, Chug Effendi, raising the money to finance these things. Well, in any event, the Guardian finally announced the crusade, you remember. You remember how stunned the Baha'i world was, how spurred into action it was at the same time. And I recall the next year when the Guardian returned, from being away, I always met them at the airport, and the Guardian was escorted, not through customs and all this business, but we went around on the outside to his automobile, and Rhea Conham went through custom with the bags and so on. She was delayed this, then I went back and helped her, and she was delayed because she had some things she had to declare that duty had to be paid on it. So she was declaring them and straightening out how much it was and so on. So I went and joined the Guardian again. And I'll never forget the Guardian walking back and forth by the automobile, and I joined him, and he says, no, Roy, I've been thinking while I've been away. We got to do something to stimulate the Baha'is to go into these new areas. This is the way the Guardian works. He's always figuring in advance how to do things. And I'm giving you the inside pictures while he says, we've got to figure some way to stimulate the Baha'is to go into these new areas. And he says, I've been thinking that we'll call them the Knights of Baha'u'llah. He says, what do you think about it? I said, oh, it's wonderful, Chug Effendi, but I said, after all, the past year you've been telling people to go here, go there, go somewhere else. If they'd have delayed, gone here to one of these places, if they were just well done, they'd be Knights of Baha'u'llah. I said, he said, I never told anybody to go anywhere, did I? Well, I said, Chug Effendi, maybe you did. But I said, after all, when the Guardian expresses an opinion or a hope, that's a command of the Baha'is. And if you told someone you hope to go to Johannesburg, they'd rather die than not go there. He says, don't worry, Baha'u'llah is going to richly reward those people who went out in response to my invitations earlier. Don't worry. So in any event, then he announced the Baha'i world that those people who went to these new countries during the first year would become known as Knights of Baha'u'llah. Someone asked, what are you going to call the ladies? Shall I tell you what the suggestion was made? Yeah, call them the Knighties. Better take that off the tape. Chug Effendi had a very great sense of humor himself. I never forget the time which amused me very much, amused him very much. You see, in Africa when they're teaching, and I'm digressing now from my subject, in Africa, one of the problems when the cause was spreading so rapidly was the fact that they believed that the practice is polygamy there. And the Baha'is, the pioneers, wondered what to do. Here's people who want to be Baha'is, but they got 3 wives or 4 wives. What are you going to do about it? We believe in monogamy. The Guardian says what has happened before a person is a Baha'i, that's none of our business. And if he has 3 wives, he continues to have 3 wives. But after he becomes a Baha'i, he doesn't get number 4. He gets all he's got. Well, this is what the amusing thing that interested me. One evening the Guardian came over and he said, well, I have a very interesting cable today from Africa. And he said there's a young Baha'i there who's a very fine, a young man. No, I'm getting 2 stories next. He says there was a young man who said to be a Baha'i, accepted the faith, but never declared himself. So the Baha'is there went to talk to the young man, and they said, now look at, you're a Baha'i, you believe in the teachings, you're teaching now to everyone else. Why don't you become a Baha'i? He said, well, he said, I'll tell you. He says, you see, I have 1 wife. He says, I got married to a very beautiful young lady. He says, I know if I become a Baha'i, I can't marry her. So after I marry her, I'll become such an answer to the and I'll become a Baha'i. But the Guardian thought that was, he got a lot of amusement out of that. Things like that amuse the Guardian very much. Instead of an austere character, you can see the nature of Sugar Fendi. It was the next year, when the end of this first year was about up. And Sugar Fendi came over, as it was his practice, to have dinner in the evenings. And he said, I figured that we've got 102 of the 131 countries, new countries, settled. He said, what figures, how do your figures show? And I said, well, mine are the same, Sugar Fendi. I might explain to you that I sort of kept a record of things like that for the Guardian to facilitate some of his work, but he kept his own records anyway. Anyway, he checked with me, and then we balanced. And he said, now there are 16 countries behind the Iron Curtain. We're probably not going to be able to establish the cause because of the situations. That's so many. Then we got 5 areas which are really private preserves. We're going to have great difficulty, like Anticosti Island in the St. Lawrence River. It belongs to a lumbering concern, and they go on the island except when they're cutting lumber. And there's a number of places in different parts of the world that have been set up in this 10-year crusade for settlements. More like those, it was very difficult. Now he says, you add those. Then he said, we got a record from the various NSAs of so many pioneers who are ready to go. So we virtually finished this phase of the crusade. Now, I said, bear in mind that the task of spreading the faith around the world is accomplished when we have the faith established in all of these 131 countries. Because then the faith will be established in 259 countries and islands of the world. So that's what fills this task, and that is the main part of the 10-year crusade. He says this at the end of the first year, and we've virtually done it. We virtually won this crusade. He says, you see, Daniel said it would take till 1963. He says, we're 9 years ahead of Daniel. He says, of course, Daniel didn't know what kind of a prophet Baha'u'llah was going to be. Well, I said, Sugar Effendi, if I may say it, Daniel also didn't know what kind of a guardian the cause of God was going to have today. Well, when the work started to spread to be established in Africa, Africa seemed to be the pride and joy of the Guardian. And he spoke about the future of Africa, the glory which was the future of Africa, the wonder which was the future of Africa. He started to speak about these pioneers who were down there and the work they were doing. And he would wax eloquent about what's going to happen through the teaching services of these pioneers. Now, bear in mind, I was 14 years or 13 years chairman of the National Teaching Committee in the United States. All my life I've been interested in teaching, so I thought I knew something about teaching. And as the Guardian would talk, he'd talk every night about this thing, about the wonder, and about how many people are going to become Baha'is. And as he spoke, I thought, well, I'd hate to be the one that's making these prognostications, and next year find that I'm a little bit over-optimistic. I never said a word, naturally, of course. But I had these thoughts in my mind. Shortly after this discussion about the 9 years ahead of schedule, the guardian came over again, all full of enthusiasm, and he reached down and pulled his cables out. 500 new Baha'is in the Tiso district in Uganda. 300 new Baha'is in Tanganyika. So many new Baha'is in Kenya. And all of these different things. And he said, just look at how wonderful this is. They want to establish, they're not interested in establishing the cause there. They want to now establish their local assemblies and national assemblies. They've asked me if they can establish local assemblies as they get 9 people in each place. And he was very, very enthusiastic and happy. So he finished talking. He had to practice, and he talked for a while, and then he'd take a few sips of coffee. He always spoke after dinner, and he'd take a few sips of coffee, and then he'd talk some more, and a few more sips of coffee, and that's the way the evening went. So he finished talking about this wonder of Africa, and took a few sips of coffee. Then he turned and he looked at me. I was always the one who directed his comments. He said, some of you people a year ago, when I started to tell you about what was going to happen in Africa, he said, you didn't think I knew what I was talking about, didn't you? I said, well, Shoghi Effendi, I must say, as far as I'm concerned, I thought you were very optimistic. Very optimistic. Now, friends, this is his message, and I want you to, I think he meant this for everyone, so I'm saying it to you. He says, Leroy, I want to tell you something. I want to tell you something. Whenever I say a thing will happen, it will happen, and don't you have to question it for 1 second. If I say a thing is going to happen, it will happen. Otherwise, I wouldn't say it. Now, I said, of course. It's dependent upon the Baha'is. I am the guardian of the cause. I can't go out and do this teaching work that I call the believers to do. I've got to stay here in the Holy Land. So they have got to be the ones to rise up and do the things the way I've called them to, the way the Master called them to do. And if they will do what I have told them to do, when I tell you a thing will happen, it will happen. You don't need to question it 1 minute. But I'm sharing this with you seriously because of the following facts. The next year, when I went to Europe, he said, now I want you to stop and visit with the NSA of a certain country in Europe. You speak very plainly to them and very directly to them, so they understand. You tell them that the time is right for mass conversion in their country. And if they will arise and get all of their people to go out and teach the way the Master's called them to do and the way I've encouraged them to do, there will be mass conversion in that country in Europe. The time is right for it. He says those people have suffered in 2 wars. The guardian didn't go into these things of who was responsible, you were responsible, and so on. He looked upon these problems of the world as a refining fire that were refining people's souls and preparing them for the kingdom of God. He says these people have suffered in 2 wars, and they are ready to become Baha'is. The next year when I went to Europe, same number of Baha'is in that country as had been before. I met with the National Assembly, I met with the National Teaching Committee. And I said, look at you people, here's what the guardian said. Here was experience about Africa, and what he said, that if the Baha'is do what he says, this will occur. It hasn't occurred. What are you doing? The only answer is that you're not doing what the Master told you to do and what the guardian has told you to do. The only conclusion you can reach when Shoghi Effendi's prophecies and promises are not fulfilled is that the Baha'is haven't done what they were told to do. Now, why do I mention this specifically and forcefully to you people? Because Shoghi Effendi expected a lot more Baha'is in the United States during the 10-year crusade than occurred. He confidently expected lots more white people in the cause, lots more colored people in the cause. We haven't got it. in the numbers the Guardian expected. Well, I think I'm not criticizing, I'm not lecturing, I'm just presenting to you these facts. The Guardian spoke, he wrote. Get some of his writings again and reread them of what he said about the spread of the cause in America, where he called America the citadel of the Baha'i world, the citadel of the teaching work of the cause. That if you didn't have Baha'is in large volume in America, the teaching work over the entire world would suffer because you wouldn't have enough pioneers to send out. You wouldn't have enough money to finance the activities. And this great spiritual bounty which Abdu'l-Baha gave in the tablets of the divine plan, the spiritual birthright with which he impregnated the American nation, would be lost. I can, as forcibly as I can, call your attention to the fact that the Guardian of the cause of God expected lots more Baha'is in this great country. Now, it's not too late. Let's arise and gain those victories at the present time. Speaking of Africa, I share with you another experience which is not very pleasant. It's very sad, in fact. One evening, but it shows again another facet of Shoghi Effendi and how he was directing affairs at the World Center. He came over one evening and pushed aside his plate. We called him, said, Shoghi Effendi, please eat a little something and talk to the friends later about your cake. He said, well, all right. And he took a little food and took a few bites and pushed it aside. And I'll never forget, I was so astonished. He had the most, the saddest, the most depressed look on his face. Almost looked like he had tears in his eyes. And he said, Leroy, he says, what do the Baha'is think of their guardians? And I looked, stood up, half stood up. I showed the Effendi. I don't know to understand what you're saying. He says, I'm saying exactly what I mean. What do the Baha'is think of their guardian? I said, Shoghi Effendi, they love the guardian. They adore the guardian. They give their life for the guardian. He said, well, he said, we've had terrible news. One of the Baha'is from America has gone to Africa and died. The same day, some of the Persian Baha'is who went to such and such an island to establish the cause, they've all been put in prison. And we also had another island off the coast of Africa, and they took all of the Baha'is, put them in a boat, and sent them to the mainland, and said, stay out of here. We don't want you anymore. Well, I said, Shoghi Effendi, if I can speak. I said, I'm from America. I've grown up in America. When I was young, I was I had an appreciation of what was taking place in the atmosphere and the condition of the Baha'is. And I've worked in the teaching field, and I know how the American Baha'is feel. They feel, Shoghi Effendi, grateful to you. They've had the tablets of the divine plan for all these 25, 30 years, and what have we done with them? Nothing. Well, you've shown them how to serve. You've shown them the pathway. And they're grateful, eternally grateful to you. And I said, furthermore, Shoghi Effendi, don't think that the American Baha'is have thought to go out and do this work, follow in the footsteps of the great dawnbreakers in Persia and not suffer. They expect to suffer. They expect to be put in jail. They expect to be martyred. And if they're not, they're going to be disappointed. I said, this is what you've done to the American Baha'is, and this is the way they feel towards you. Anything that you say or you do, they're sacrifice their life at a moment's notice. And I said, I know that there are other parts of the world it's exactly the same way. So I'm not speaking alone for the American Baha'is. Well, he said, El Bailey was, the name El Bailey is familiar to many of us. El Bailey died in Tripoli today. And then these Persian Baha'is from this island were in jail, and these Persian Baha'is on another island were sent to the mainland and not allowed to teach and all the pioneering work gone. And he said, this is what I do. I send the Baha'is out I call upon them to do these things, and then they have to suffer this way. It disturbs me very much. He was very sad because these things had occurred. This is the side of Shug Effendi you should know, of how he was with the Baha'is, the pioneers everywhere, and experiencing their experiences. Well, the next night, the guardian came over, again for his dinner, and he read a cablegram that he had sent to the Baha'i world. You're all familiar with it, in which he spoke about the great women of the Baha'i faith. Mae Maxwell, who was buried in South America. Martha Root, who's buried in Honolulu. Keen Ransom Taylor, who's passed away serving the cause and is buried in Persia. And he enumerated different ones. Marion Jack in Sofia in Europe. And Dorothy Baker, who was drowned off of the shores of Italy. And Emma Bailey, who's passed away and is now to be married in Africa, bringing honor and glory to Africa. Then he talked to us. He said the determination of that woman is what the Baha'i should have to win this crusade. When Ella Bailey, she was old, she was sick, she was crippled. I don't know how many of you know it. Crippled from her thigh down. Had to use steel braces and walk that way. When she got to New York, she took sick, and they told her she couldn't go to Africa. She had to remain in America because she'd die in Africa. She's told the doctors and told the Baha'i, she says, I will go to Africa to teach this cause if I have to crack myself on my elbow. It's the only thing I've got to use all the way to Africa. I'm going, he says, that's the determination that makes the cause of God succeed. Well, then he said, I'll share with you another cable. He had cabled to the Baha'is in Tripoli, and he said, purchase suitable property, suitable area, and arrange for the erection of a suitable monument for Ella Bailey in Tripoli. And the guardian of the cause would pay for it. Well, then Shug Effendi, may I tell you a story? He said, yes. I said, you know, I was treasurer of the NSA in America when we were raising $1 million in 2 years to finish the interior of the temple. I was located in my business in Chicago at the time, and I was in San Francisco in connection with my business. Now Bailey phoned and asked if Sylvia and I would come over and have tea with her, which we, of course, were delighted to do. We had tea and we visited and so forth. And then she says, Leroy, says we badly need money for the temple. She says, no, I haven't very much, you know. But in my will, I have set aside $150 to arrange for my burial. And she says, this old body of mine is no good. She says, I've changed my will and told him to throw my body in the potter's field. The $150 I want to make is a contribution to the temple. I said, no, Ella, you know, we need $1 million. We don't need $150. $1 million is what we need. And take my advice. You keep the $150 the way you have it and arrange for a proper burial for yourself. I think the friends would like for you to do that. She said, no, all right, my mind is quite made up. I've changed my will, and here's the $150 for the temple. So I said, Shug Effendi, here's the woman, unknown, determination and a devotion that cannot hardly be equal in the Baha'i world. She instructed in her will that a body be thrown in the potter's field, and yet the guardian of the cause of God, the guardian of the cause of God is going to erect her monument. It's quite moving, isn't it? A little bit later, There was a Persian Baha'i and his wife went pioneering on another island. I think outside India somewhere, I'm not sure. I've forgotten the man's name and I've forgotten the island. And he had great difficulty. His wife took sick. He couldn't find work. His money was running out. He sent his wife back to Persia. He wrote the Guardian letters asking if he would be permitted to return to Persia because he couldn't find business. He didn't have money. The Guardian, I wrote most of the Guardian's mail about the 10-year crusade under his direction, of course. He says, you write and tell him to stay there and to persevere. And if he perseveres, that I will guarantee him all of the seeds he sows will produce results. So I wrote this. A little bit later, another letter. A little bit later, the same answer. A little bit later, another letter. A little bit later, another answer. Persevere and stay there, by all means, because you're going to produce results. Finally, cables came. And the Guardian said, send the same cable's answers. This man should persevere and stay there. One evening he came over, he was all excited. He says, I have a cable from this man. What do you think he says? He's got 100 new Baha'is in the past few days. They want to establish 2 local spiritual assemblies there because the cause is spread into 2 different cities. He says, just think what would have happened. The cause of God wouldn't be established in that island if that man hadn't persevered. If he'd have gone home, he'd have lost this great victory for the cause, and he himself wouldn't have won these victories. Just think of it. Perseverance is done. I promised him what would happen, and now it's happened. This great glory and honor has come to him because he persevered and he won these victories. Why, the Jug Effendi, may I speak? He said, yes. I said, I don't think that man won these victories. I think you did. This was 1956, my friend. He said, I think you did. Why, I told you how humble Jug Effendi is. He says, Leroy, that is right. I won those victories. And the Baha'is of the world will be amazed at the victories I will win through them, if they will do what I have told them to do. Well, I sat back. I thought, I've never in my life heard Jug Effendi talk this way. He won the victory. He's going to win other victories through the Baha'is. What does he mean? What is he referring to? He's never talked this way. 1957, we knew what he was talking about. And the great victories which the Baha'is won all over the world in the last 5 years of this crusade, I tell you, Jug Effendi was at the head of the army of the Supreme Concourse, and he was leading each and every Baha'i, directing them to their destiny and winning these victories for them. I'm just as convinced as I'm standing here, because I saw how Jug Effendi worked, how his spirit grew, that dynamic. And as far as I am concerned, he, through the Baha'is, won these victories of the 10-year crusade. Another evening, Jug Effendi came over, and I want you to pay close attention to this, friends. This is very important. He says, I have a cable from America that such and such a woman, an elderly woman, sickly, having complications, not a good teacher, wanted to go to one of these Virgin Islands to teach. I'll never forget Rhea comes and Jug Effendi, you're surely not going to send her there. I know her. It'd be impossible. She couldn't do anything. She'd just go there, and she's not a teacher. She's not a public figure. Jug Effendi says, I came with the American NSA this afternoon to send her at once. Send her at once. Now, he says, the thing that you people forget is this, and this is what I say to the friends, pay close attention to this. He says, the thing that you overlook is this, that the all-conquering spirit of Baha'u'llah, the power of the Holy Spirit that gives the second birth and quickens individuals in the cause, can only get into a city or an area through a Baha'i. It doesn't get in there any other way. No other way does it get into that city. The Baha'is are the instruments that carry that spirit in amongst the people. And if that woman goes there, and all that never opens her mouth. The Spirit of Baha'u'llah is in that city, and it had started its leavening process. It says the leavening process of the world today is the Spirit of Baha'u'llah. And this is the weapon you have in your hands, friends. You are the ones who are the custodians of this Holy Spirit to spread throughout the world. It's in your hands, the Baha'is' hands. Who are we to have this great bounty that the leavening? For what did Jesus say to his disciples? He says, ye are the salt of the earth. The salt is lost its savor. Wherewith will the earth be savored? And Shoghi Effendi says, this leavening power of the world today is the Holy Spirit of Baha'u'llah, and that can only get over the world through the Baha'is. They're the instruments. I asked Shoghi Effendi one night, I said, Shoghi Effendi, why is it you want the Baha'is to scatter? We have 15 or more in assembly. Say, well, scatter out, go into new areas. Introduce the cause in new centers. I said, why do you want to do that? But our theory we worked on in America has been we'll take some of the large centers of population. We build a big, strong assembly. We will have members of different religious faiths. We'll have Baha'is from different racial backgrounds, and they all be functioning together harmoniously and beautifully and showing what the Baha'i spirit is. I said, they don't know we teach. We say, now, if you don't think we can do what we're saying we can do, go and look at the city of Chicago or Los Angeles or Riverside or wherever it might be. And the Guardian gave this answer, which was very interesting. He said, I explained to you the other night that the leavening power of the world today, which is changing the destiny of society, is the Holy Spirit of Baha'u'llah. And that can only be spread in an intensive way through the Baha'is. Now, he said we have Baha'is in 2,500 centers. If we have Baha'is in 5,000 centers, think of how much greater the influence of the Holy Spirit is going to be. If you have it in 10,000 centers, think of how great the power of the Spirit is going to be in this leavening process that the Holy Spirit works in all those centers. Friends, you should bear in mind the Guardian's viewpoint. The Guardian's viewpoint was that God had given us a plan to do, our 10-year crusade. But God had a major plan of His own in which He was shaping the destinies of nations and its peoples. And shaping the destiny of the nations and the peoples mean that He was through every means driving them towards His cause. So that if we were prepared to do our part and we properly built this world order of Baha'u'llah, the forces in nature, God's purposes being served in all things that happen. Let us lead to great calamity in our lives. Wars, anything, sickness, plagues, anything that happens, it's God's plan of driving the people towards His own cause. Elevating their consciousness to a universalism. And when they become universal, the only universal religion in the world is Baha'i, so they're brought together. And they come into the faith and grow. Now that's one of the reasons the Guardian said. He said the other reason is this, that very shortly, pay attention to this phrase, very shortly we are going to reach the point where, as the Master promised, people will come into the faith in droves. That point is just ahead of us. And if they're going to come in droves, if they have to come to 2,000 centers, we only have 2,000 centers. We have 5,000 centers yet. That's much more. That's how much faster the cause spreads. Says that is why we believe in scattering. Now another facet of Shoghi Effendi, I know when he was talking along this line, he came over one evening and he said, now, a part of the crusade we've asked for 2,500 centers. He said, do you think that the Baha'is of the world could establish the faith in 3,500 centers? Well, of course, I always have to talk. Say things maybe I shouldn't. Shoghi Effendi is the type, if you say, yes, you can walk 10 feet, he'll give you 20 feet to walk to show how much capacity we have. And the guardian, when the pilgrims were there and they were getting ready to leave, he'd always ask them, now what do you intend to do? You're going to do this, you're going to do that. Then they'd explain. So you come say, now listen, don't make too many promises, because if you give the guardian that finger, he's going to take your whole hand. So be careful. Well, Shoghi Effendi said, do you think we could establish the faith in 3,500 centuries? I said, very easily, Shoghi Effendi, very easily. Somebody else is going to do it. The next day he came over with his cable to the Baha'i world, calling for 5,000 centers. Now, how many centers did we have at the end of the 10-year crusade? How many centers in the Baha'i world? 15,000 centers. At the end of the crusade. Teaches you how to measure the great success of this 10-year crusade and what was done. I've been asked, friends, very often, did the guardian tell us or indicate that he was going to pass away in 1957? Well, as we look back now to many of the meetings and many things Shoghi Effendi said, the answer was yes. On the other hand, things occurred where the answer was no. I can say we were sublime, we never even thought it was possible. There's no question about that. One experience I had, I'll share with you to indicate what I mean. Two experiences. One evening, it was when Horace Holly was on his pilgrimage. You all know Horace. Those of you who don't, you know his name, the great work he's done in America, especially in developing the administrative order on a local and a national scale. And the Guardian was talking about the future of the administrative order. And he traced it through the development of the administrative order, and then the word order of Baha'u'llah, and then the Baha'i World Commonwealth, and the conditions in the world, and how the government would be, and how it would all function. It's one of the most glorious things I've ever heard. And certainly one of the most wonderful things the Guardian ever spoke in connection with this subject of the involvement of the faith in the future. And as we went home, as I say, I told you, I walked home with the Guardian usually. I said to myself, well, I hope the Guardian continues on the same theme, because it's so wonderful. Said to that, we got halfway to the house, and he stopped, and he turned around, and he looked at me. He said, you know, Leroy, the days of the Bab, the cause was established in 2 countries. The days of Baha'u'llah at the end, 15 countries. The days of the Master, 35 countries. Today, the Baha'i faith is established in over 258 countries and islands. He says the weight, the problems, the carrying forward of this work has weighted me down. It has me weighted down, and I tell you, I can't carry the load anymore. I have gotten that relief. Well, I said, Shoghi Effendi, I think the time has come when the whole procedure in the Holy Land has to be changed, if I may say so. I said, you go up into the afternoon, you go into the gardens, and you're with the Eastern pilgrims, then you come down after you visit with them and talk to them and answer questions, and you've gone into the shrines and prayed and chatted for them. Then you come down and you visit the women who have been visiting with the economy in the afternoon, and you talk with them and visit with them. Then you have your cables and one thing and another to send, and then after that you come over and you have dinner with the Western pilgrims, and you stay till 10, 11 o'clock at night, maybe later than that, depending on the subject. I said, all this correspondence you have, I think you should make a change. I think what you should do is give all that correspondence for economy myself. We'll digest it. We'll take it over. You don't even look at it. And we'll just put little notes to you. American NSA in their minutes of such and such a date ask these questions. You can say, tell them so and so, so. Indian NSA asks so and so. German NSA asks so and so. This happens and that happens. We'll take the correspondence, all you have to do is make your notations, what to do. And I said, furthermore, meeting all of these pilgrims individually, No guardian of the future is going to do that. Why don't you have an audience of 30 minutes or an hour in the afternoon? Everybody comes, you answer their questions, you talk to them, and that finishes. Then that'll give you some relief. He turned again to me. He says, Leroy, time is right for those things. But he says, only God can give me relief. Now, is the guardian speaking about this drastic change? I don't know. There were certain things he wanted me to do, and this was in October 1957. And I wrote to the guardian. We had gotten the enemies of the cause out of Baji. We had the property in our hands. We had the titles and everything. And I came to the guardian, shall I proceed to destroy these buildings? When he came back, he says, no, hold it till I get back, because when I get back, I want to supervise the destruction. He also wrote me about certain other matters he wanted done. He says, Maria Conham amplified his instructions, and she said, the guardian's very anxious to engage us in new work when he gets back to the Holy Land, and he'd like to have you, if you can, get these things all finished up before he returns, then he can start immediately. Well, there you are. This was in October. I wanted to share with you, in May of 1957, the guardian left the end of May, the last time, from the Holy Land. And he was summarizing the victories of the first 5 years of this crusade. How we had settled all these countries, how we'd won all these victories, how in areas where we just to introduce one or two Baha'is, we had local assemblies, national assemblies. The cause was spreading so rapidly, and it was beyond all comprehension. And he said, the guardian said, I never, in all my wildest dreams, thought that the Baha'is of the world could do what they had done. It has been a miracle. What they have done has been a miracle. Who would have dreamt that at the end of these first 5 years we would have far exceeded the goals of the crusade in almost every one of the various avenues of service? And then he said these significant things. He said, but I want to tell you that the victories of the second 5 years will be far, far more wonderful than the first 5 years. They will be far more glorious. They will be far more dramatic. He says they will be so wonderful that the Baha'is themselves won't believe it. They just won't believe that they've won these victories, or that it's possible that it was done through them. But again, I thought, why is the guardian talking about the second 5 years? And even I said, Chug, if any, in what way will it be more glorious? He said, because that will be during the end of the 5 years, will be the beginning of mass conversion of the Baha'i faith. How will it be more dramatic? It says, in the establishment of so many new national assemblies. We started the 10-year crusade with 12 national assemblies. We ended it with how many? 56. And as the fruit of what was done during this 10-year crusade, 13 more new assemblies are to be formed in Rizwan this year, a total of 69. Think of the fruit of these great victories of the Baha'is. After Shoghi Effendi passed away in the hands of the cause, these 9 people who were elected to direct the affairs of the cause during that very complicated period, cables would come from all over the world, and we'd just sit back and say, well, just another one of Baha'u'llah's miracles. Passing of the guardian has solidified the Baha'is into a great world organism and institution. The Baha'is have been deepened in their spiritual stature. Their spiritual stature has grown, and the roots of their spiritual lives have been deepened. The guardian through this crusade has taken an obscure, small, religious group of people and made them a great world institution that is known everywhere in all the great councils of the world. He has woven and built the entire Baha'i world I want to share with you before I close. I want to share with you one of the intimate things that took place towards the end of the guardian's life. One evening he was speaking to us. There were only the members of the council there, and he was speaking about some of his own experiences. As you all know, Chuck Effendi was in England studying at Oxford University, Balliol College, when the master passed away. What a shock that he was overcome. When he arrived in Haifa, he had to be taken home in the stretcher. On the 9th night, they decided to read the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha. Now, the guardian told us, he said, I didn't know what was in the will. And I expected that in the will, Abdu'l-Baha was going to do me the high honor of calling the great conclave which would elect the Universal House of Justice. That's what I thought the master was going to have me do. He said, instead of that, what happened? They read the will, and I found that I was the guardian of the cause. He said, and I tell you frankly, I didn't want to be the guardian. I knew what it meant, and I wasn't prepared to assume those responsibilities. I didn't consider myself worthy to assume such responsibilities. I didn't think I could carry them out properly. So, I left the Holy Land. I went to Switzerland in the mountains, and I fasted, and I died, and I prayed, and I meditated. And I did all of these things. He said, the greatest thing I did, and this, friends, please pay attention to this. He says, the greatest thing I did, I fought myself until I conquered myself. And when I conquered myself, then I returned to the Holy Land and turned myself over to God, and I was the guardian. Now, he said, I don't care whether you're a hand of the cause or not. I don't care whether you're a member of the Universal House of Justice or not. Knights of Baha'u'llah, NSAs, pioneers, anything. Every Baha'i in this world has to fight himself every day. And the more he conquers himself, turns himself over to God, the greater will be his service to the cause, and the greater instrument he will be to serve the cause. Baha'i must become like a purely polished mirror which reflects the Holy Spirit. He should become like a reed, by conquering himself and getting rid of all of the debris in his life. And make himself a perfect vehicle through which the power of the Holy Spirit can spread into the world and bring this quickening and leavening power to all the peoples of the world. That is what the Baha'is of the world must do every day. Fight themselves till they've conquered themselves and become more purified. Then they will become perfect instruments, and the cause of God will spread. Now, Shoghi Effendi said that he thought that the will and testament was to call the great conclave. Isn't it interesting that he himself, before he passed away, called this Great World Congress in London, April 21st, 1963, and at the same time the Universal House of Justice was elected. The thing is that Shoghi Effendi didn't realize that he not only was going to call this election, but in fact he had to build from the ground up and build the Universal House of Justice. And that is exactly what he did. He built the local assemblies, he built the national assembly, he built the world center of the faith, and then he crowned it finally with the House of Justice. This House of Justice, just one or two words before we close. They're all young, they're comparatively most young men. It's very interesting. Most of the hands are called, they're considerably older. These people are mostly young people. All of them had very varied experience. One of the things that surprised me very much when I got back to the Lord of that after my illness was to find the manner in which they took hold of things, did things, no hesitation, a vitality that was very surprising, and an assurance which was very surprising. I think that you should all feel that the cause of God is in good hands and is strongly protected. I remember one time one of the pilgrims asked Shoghi Effendi, what about your successor? He says, don't you worry about my successor. The cause of God will always be fully protected, strongly protected. And I think you can be assured that that is the way the situation of the world today. This question of divine guidance, which is assured the universal house of justice, infallibility. I just one little incident which is of interest. This 9-year crusade that's coming up, the House of Justice is going to announce. It's grown out of a proposal made by the Hands for another 10-year crusade. We wanted to announce in the Congress a 10-year crusade was, you see, so you had all these people, you'd have all the spirit and everything about it. But the House of Justice felt they wanted to study it a bit, and then we had meetings together and talked, and they said, we'd rather think we should have about a year to consolidate. And we should garner what proofs are still left out of the 10-year crusade before launching another one. All right, that was fine. So we made suggestions of what assemblies, NSAs, could be formed in April 21st, 1963, or 1964, in this coming Rizwan. And when we met again a little bit later, the House of Justice said, now, we have decided that we should have a National Assembly in the Hawaiian Islands. Now, that wasn't included in our recommendations, you see. So after it was discussed and agreed upon, I said, now, I'd like to tell you something that's of interest. I carried on most of the correspondence for the Guardian in connection with the 10-year crusade. And I have written 2 or 3 letters to Honolulu on behalf of the Guardian, in which he says when you have a local assembly and have one of the islands, these 5 main islands, and a certain number of other assemblies, you can establish your own national assembly. Now I mention this to show how this continuity in guidance continues. Here's the House of Justice knows nothing about these things. And to a certain extent, it's illogical to have an NSA there because they're the 15th state of the American Union. I know I was raised with the Guardian when he talked about it the night he instructed me to write this letter. Someone at the table raised the question. Well, he says, I know it's a state of America, but he says it's 2,000 miles away. Far enough to have your own NSA. You see how interesting these things fold and carry on. Friends, in closing, I want to call your attention to this one point. You know, there are times in history which are full of destiny. In those periods of destiny, thrust greatness upon the people who have to be participating at that time. Destiny has caused greatness because of the Baha'i. Some people strive for greatness and fail. Other people strive for greatness and achieve it. Baha'is have achieved greatness in spite of themselves. Destiny has thrust greatness upon the Baha'i world, a handful of people. All this bounty that has come to us, for goodness sake, let's not demand the discipline. Let's rather intensify it, so that this cause of God can go forward by leaps and bounds. One thing we should bear in mind, and that is that religion sort of repeats itself like history does. Usually study Christianity, study Islam, study Buddhism. The first 100 years of a religious era is usually the cause spreads very slowly. But it sinks its roots down deep into the soil. of the consciousness of the world. And by the end of that first 100 years, its administrative scheme is set up, compared with the Baha'i faith. The second 100 years is the great age, century of the propagation of the faith, because by that time, God's plan and the order which is being set up by the new people come together. And people come into the cause by the thousands. The great period of propagation of every religion is the second century. We've entered the second century with the winning of this great crusade. And the Guardian said, as great as this crusade is, the greatest spiritual crusade in history, it in itself is only a forerunner of the still greater victories which the Baha'is are going to win in the future. Let's gird our loins. Let's mount our steeds, as the Bab asked us to do, and go forward to victory upon victory, so that the glory of the Lord cover the earth as the waters cover the sea.
Question of loyalty.
Of what?
Of loyalty.
Yes.
In which it varies depending upon the locality or the country in regard to laws. Now, what about the unwritten laws? Are we to support these?
That's a very subtle question. I suppose you mean perhaps in connection with civil rights matters or otherwise.
Well,
that's the outer symbol or expression. You see, there's a general principle in the cause that order and unity is more important than being right. Now, that may sound a little strange at first, but as you analyze it, you find that if the Baha'is are unified in an orderly way, that even if things are wrong, that unity and that order will right them in due course. Now that's within the faith. But I think that's a principle that applies throughout the world, and that's the basis on which we have loyalty to government. We feel that you've got to obey the government because you have to have law and you have to have order. Even if that government has many laws which are completely unjust. This question, talking specifically now about the attitude which the National Assembly has taken, I understand, is that the Baha'is are free to join in any activities, and I'm speaking now of civil rights, as long as it's in accord with the law. And the law, the local law. Well, the local law in one city is different from the local law in another, so they're under the direction of two different laws. But specifically, I would say, and I'm sure that's the intent of the ruling of the National Assembly, that it's the law in the land where you live. And you can't take and assume an unwritten law. Because if you do, then everybody has its own assumption of what an unwritten law should be. And then you have chaos and difficulty. The second thing I want to point out, my friends, and I want you to pay close attention to this. These problems which are arising in connection with this specific subject, let's say, of civil rights, it's the seething of the spirit of the day that is causing it. It's this leavening of the Holy Spirit that is causing it. And for the first time, God's got a hand in it. And according to God's own will and His own way, this is going to be solved, and this seething is not going to stop until it is solved, and solved properly. You see, you shouldn't think it's only America that has these problems. Go to England and talk to some of the people about the class system there. The peerage, the lords, the earls, and the common people, and the gentry. And then you find you have the same thing as you've got here. Go to India, where the cause is spreading like wildfire with the caste system, these 5 castes. The Baha'i is the only force that's gone in there and unified these camps. The religious prejudice of them. God has released this power and it's working now with a force and an energy that is going to drive the world quickly to its destiny. And we in our hands hold a great power to lessen their suffering, to lessen the difficulties of the world by ourselves spreading an order which will be a source of salvation.
I have three things to tell you. One, Dr. Ugo Dakari, head of the cause recently coming to the United States, will be in San Diego on April 4th at the Silvergate Savings and Loan. Please see any of the friends from San Diego to give you a specific address for this occasion.